What is your role at Anchorage Police Department?
I am the director of Diversion Programming.
What does diversion programming involve?
There's a pathway for you to go, and I, as the officer, could say, this is what I might have to charge you with, or I can get you into this direction today if you're interested, and you follow those recommendations, and these charges don't get filed. If you fail, the charges go forward to the prosecutor's office. You're giving someone the opportunity to actually avoid, when appropriate and when the public safety is not at risk, and I want to emphasize that, avoid the criminal justice system, because the collateral consequences of even being charged with a crime, let alone convicted of it, are really significant.
Welcome to the East Anchorage Book Club. I'm your host, Andrew Gray. The purpose of this podcast is to tell the stories of Alaskans of interest and importance. Today's guest is Steve Williams, the Director of Diversion Programming for the Anchorage Police Department. Diversion is one tool law enforcement can use to offer individuals access to mental health and addiction treatment at the point of arrest, instead of charging them and booking them into jail. Previously, Steve was the CEO at the Alaska Mental Health Trust, and prior to that, he worked for the Mental Health Court. We discuss all three of his roles in detail on today's episode. Steve Williams, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Where did you grow up?
I grew up on the East Coast, east of Washington, D.C., a little town called Bowie, Maryland.
And K through 12 there?
Yeah, I pretty much spent my entire life in Bowie, and then high school, D.C. I went to Gonzaga College High School.
Oh, that's where Lisa Murkowski's sons went. I just learned that from reading her book. Yeah,
great high school. Probably those 4 years, I always think back and people ask me, I think those 4 years probably the most formative years of my life so far.
What did your parents do?
I actually come from a public service family. So my dad served in the Air Force. I was a captain, and then went and worked for the federal government his entire professional career. And my mom was a public educator. Worked in early childhood special ed classroom for 20 plus years.
You went to undergrad in Baltimore. Were you like equidistant between DC and Baltimore with Bowie?
No, Bowie is a little bit closer to DC, about 20 minutes outside of DC,
Okay.
50 minutes to Baltimore.
Okay. So graduated from high school in DC and then went to undergrad. And then you said you came directly to Alaska?
Yeah, I found my way here through a volunteer program. When I was a junior at Loyola, I was watching what was going on with the senior class ahead of me in the springtime when people are looking for jobs and wondering what they're going to do, and it seemed like a lot of stress. And I wasn't really sure what I wanted to do. So junior year, I started looking into volunteer programs and looked into the Peace Corps, but ended up going with the Jesuit Volunteer Corps. That gave me the opportunity to pick where I wanted to be generally. They place you, but like I selected the Northwest region of the U.S., and they give you a list of placements, you rank them, and then they try and place you in your ranking, but there's no guarantees. So that's how I ended up in Alaska.
So Gonzaga is a Catholic school.
Yep,
And
Jesuit
Jesuits.
always.
So you grew up Catholic?
Yes.
And Pope Francis was Jesuit.
Maybe. I chuckle because I'm not a practicing Catholic.
I'm kind of figuring out how to ask.
Yes, I'm not a practicing Catholic.
All right, but were you Catholic then? Like you were practicing Catholic when you decided to do the Jesuit program?
No, I mean, I was raised Catholic. Elementary school, middle school, Catholic. High school, as we just said, Catholic. Loyola College in Baltimore, another Jesuit institution. I certainly was exposed, and I certainly think that education has helped to shape my view of the world. I am not a practicing Catholic, though, in the traditional sense, although I'm a spiritual person. I'm just not following that flavor of spirituality.
Gotcha. So the Jesuit volunteer program got you to Alaska. What did you do?
The placement was over at the Arc of Anchorage on Northern Lights. I worked in the rec center, and I was working with adults, mostly adults with intellectual developmental disabilities, doing recreational programming and also life skills development. There would be like cooking classes where I would teach folks how to make basic meals.
Did you like it?
I loved it. It was great interaction. It wasn't the first time I had been exposed to people with intellectual or developmental disabilities, but it certainly was the first time that my job was focused on helping them learn these daily living skills, but also just community integration, running programs where we would go out to a coffee shop and spend the day there or spend the afternoon there, learn how to buy a cup of coffee, sit down and have the cup of coffee, and just do what everyone does, which is when they go to a coffee shop, sit down, talk, and get to know people.
And did you like being in Alaska?
Love being in Alaska. I haven't left in 33 years.
Yeah. So what year was it that you came?
I moved up here in August of 92.
So that's where my research might be off, because I thought you went to graduate school in Michigan.
I did. I went to graduate school at the University of Michigan, got my master's in social work, and that was 98 to 2000. Took an intentional break. I was still working at the Arc of Anchorage, so I resigned.
So do you, like, with the Jesuit thing, they placed you at the Arc of Anchorage, but then you just kept the job for 5 years, or?
Yeah, it was a year commitment. Wow. And then I'd made some connections. They needed some staff.
And why did you decide to go to get a master's in social work?
Couple reasons. One was I had been working for the ARC, and really I think I had risen to the level that I was going to rise to. There was management that were there, and I wasn't going to go anywhere. And it was really a good time just to take a break and go back to school. And I had gotten exposed into the social services system here in Anchorage and really found a passion with that and just social justice flavor from Jesuit education, from my volunteer experience. And yeah, it's just good timing.
So got your master's in social work.
Correct.
And then what?
Came right back. Then that was the goal. When I left with my wife, she also went there and got her master's degree in social work at the same time. I took a macro nonprofit management mental health track. She was on a clinical track, which is one of the beauties about Michigan, was like they had different tracks at the clinical and the macro levels. Always intended to come back, and came back and started looking for jobs.
Returning to Alaska with your master's, where was the first job?
The first job was actually with the Boys and Girls Clubs. Danielle got a job there first, and I was looking around, and eventually they had a program that was setting up rural clubhouses, and they were looking for someone to help set up clubhouses in the Bristol Bay region. So that's what I did for about a year, was help set up new ones, and they had some established ones that sort of needed to get up and running.
So I guess you went out to Bristol Bay.
Mm-hmm.
I think it would be hard to do, because I feel like some of those communities wouldn't have enough kids to make a Boys and Girls Club work.
You would think that, but think about rural Alaska, think about a small community, and think about where do people gather. And I think of New Stuyahawk, small community. And what do kids need to do? And positive place for kids after school. What are they going to do? Programming, place to go do schoolwork, maybe even a place to get something to eat, play some basketball. Really, you can make a clubhouse with a small number of kids and really make it a thriving place that people want to go to and the community sees and wants to be a part of.
So you did that for a year.
Yeah.
And then what?
Then a position opened up at the court system. The Anchorage Mental Health Court had just gotten up and running, and the project coordinator, Kathy Trover, who I knew, reached out and said, we're looking for a case manager to help the participants of the court. If you're interested, I think you should apply. And it was my first entry into sort of this criminal justice, behavioral health space, and I applied and got that job.
What did you learn on that job?
That was like my foundation for what I've been doing for the last 25 years. It was incredible just to understand how the criminal justice system works, how it doesn't serve some populations as effectively as it should. A really good opportunity to understand different social services programs, not just IDD that I was doing at the ARC, but now I was working with what was then called South Central Counseling. Today it's Alaska Behavioral Health. So these mental health programs as well as addiction programs.
Do you have any specific stories from them that sort of illustrate, I guess, the way that the system worked well or if the system wasn't working well?
I have lots of stories. The one that always pops out in my head, and the man's deceased, so I'm going to use his name. His name is Bill Bigley. well known in Anchorage at the time, in and out of API, in and out of the correctional system, severe mental health issues, and generally spent a lot of time in downtown core area, third, fourth, fifth, and just caused problems because he was responding to internal stimuli. He was acting a little bit out of the ordinary. Sometimes it crossed the line where he might break a window or do something.
So when you say responding to internal stimuli, he was hearing voices that were like telling him to do things like schizophrenia.
Yeah. And he wasn't connecting into the supports that really could help him manage and stay in a positive light in the community. And that was the beauty of the mental health court. That was my job. He came in, had a misdemeanor charge. The idea was help people get connected to a treatment plan and to services, and then monitor that with the court, report that back, and hopefully a person is successful and those charges were dismissed or reduced. And if they weren't, then those charges were pursued however the prosecutor's office decided to pursue them.
And does that job still exist? Are there still people doing that?
Yep. So the Anchorage Mental Health Court, little fun fact, third one in the country. So Judge Stephanie Rhodes started this up. Judge John Loaf was the other judge that presided over mental health court hearings back then. It still exists today. Mental health courts also exist out in Palmer and Juneau. I helped start those up. And then I think there's a total of 14 therapeutic courts statewide. They're not all mental health. Some of them focus on DUIs or felony drug charges, but misdemeanor level wellness addiction issues. Alaska was cutting edge and still is, in my opinion, cutting edge when it comes to looking at different ways to meet the needs of folks who have behavioral health issues and have contact with criminal justice.
So in House Judiciary, we held a hearing this year on our therapeutic courts. And I will just say the numbers off the top of my head without having the paper in front of me, but I won't be that far off. But we had about 250 spots for folks in different therapeutic courts in the state.
Yeah.
We have 4,400 as of today. This census at this moment, we have about 4,400 folks who are currently incarcerated in Alaska. My feeling as the chair of judiciary, who doesn't have a lot of background knowledge, is that if we have an alternative court system that has really good results, something like 80% no recidivism, like folks who successfully complete the therapeutic court system, they do well.
Yeah.
Why aren't we using that system more? Because the part that kind of raised my eyebrows was that all of these therapeutic courts had space for a few more people on all of them. None of them were maxed out. Yeah. And my understanding is that a majority of folks who are currently in DOC have drug and alcohol abuse issues and or mental health issues. Yeah. And to me, at the very least, we should be maxing out the spaces that we have in these therapeutic courts. At the most, I think we should have more.
Sure. So I think, first of all of those courts are voluntary. So the individual has to agree that they want their court case processed through one of these courts. And if they don't, they can have their case processed through the traditional criminal justice process. The courts, I haven't looked at the current data, but I know that their capacity numbers in terms of total number of participants fluctuates. I think there are some that might have a total cap of 40, some are maybe down in the 10 or 15. And their utilization, as you were pointing out, can vary too. So at a point in time, a court could be fully utilized. And then 3 months later, it could be at 75% capacity.
Because 3 people graduated or 1 person dropped out.
Exactly. So you've got that fluctuation. And then the other variable that oftentimes is at play is what is the community treatment capacity to engage the person in so that they can actually, because part of this is you get engaged in treatment, so that they can be engaged, follow the treatment plan, enter down a path of recovery, demonstrate to that court, and then graduate.
This is jumping way ahead. Do we have treatment beds available in Anchorage today?
In terms of substance use disorder treatment, yeah, there's treatment beds available.
I don't know how many folks who are on the street who have mental health issues need to be inpatient mental health.
Right.
But if somebody did, do we have beds available for inpatient mental health treatment today?
Inpatient mental health, you just said mental health treatment, or are we still talking about SUD?
I'm not talking about SUD.
Okay, so
We've said that SUD, we have some beds available today. My question is, let's say somebody like the person you were talking, Mr. Bigley, who has untreated paranoid schizophrenia and might need to not just get an injection or take a pill, but might need some time inside.
So the highest level of care, obviously, is the Alaska Psychiatric Institute. I haven't looked at their census, but I'm guessing it's full. There are some other residential mental health programs. The Arc of Anchorage operates one. I think Alaska Behavioral Health operates one. I don't know what their capacity is, nor do I know if they're full right now. So there is some capacity. Looking forward, there are going to be crisis stabilization services coming online. South Central Foundation is going to be operating a continuum of those services, up to 24-hour crisis services. If needs to be longer, they can offer crisis residential, 2 to 7 days. If someone needs something more than that, then you're talking about, okay, how about a referral to API? So there is capacity. It's going to grow in the next, I'm hoping, SCF is projecting early this coming summer. Providence is also supposed to be coming online thereafter, sometime in the fall.
So the way I asked those questions might have felt weird, but I guess what I was saying is at this particular moment, if somebody wanted a spot in a therapeutic court for a drug and alcohol abuse issue or mental health, there theoretically should be a bed available, and not having treatment available shouldn't be the barrier.
Treatment shouldn't be the barrier, but there's always that caveat.
Because that's what I just try to wrap my head around, is that I feel like that what I often hear from folks, they'll say there's many factors, and some of the factors are that the community resources are not available. And so that's when I want to just know, how far behind are our community resources? And we're talking about having new community resources coming on board. So there might be the potential with more community resources available for more folks to be involved in this process. Now, to bounce back to your job, where you were helping folks get access to different resources and get themselves on the straight and narrow and potentially avoid incarceration.
Correct.
So I was in San Antonio for a criminal justice conference a couple of months ago, and there was a presentation about public defenders having access basically to social workers in their office to do the job that you were doing, not just for folks in a mental health court, but for folks in court, period. That we know that lots of people involved in the criminal justice system don't have stable housing, don't have employment, need treatment, and haven't found access to treatment. And so I'm curious about your thoughts about the type of job that you were doing for mental health court, about that same position being spread out and available to folks not in the mental health court.
Sure. A couple of things pop into my head. One is, sure, that would be great. And if we're talking about Alaska, we should be also thinking about the Office of Public Advocacy, because not everyone, but many of the folks that I dealt with going through the mental health court also had a guardian or a partial guardian. You've got a system in Alaska that has some of the pieces are in place, but they may not be staffed, or they may not be at the levels they need to be able to actually maneuver and get someone to the places that they need to be, whether they're in the court, of a therapeutic court or not. So I guess if I were a legislator and I was thinking about this, I'd be thinking about, okay, public defender, that's a good idea. What's going on over at the Office of Public Advocacy? What's their capacity? Because the guardians are looking for these services too, and they're trying to figure out, if someone burns a bridge, what's the next bridge that they can put someone on?
I just did an interview with Channel 2 about deaths in custody. We had the highest year, tying for the highest year in 2025. And part of the reporter's pushback, I was really making a case for geriatric parole. And she said, at least they're getting healthcare in prison, and if they're released, they may not have it. And I was like, incarceration is not a substitute for a nursing home, and it is not healthy. Being incarcerated is its own stressor. And so my fear is when you're saying like you could have these advocates working for public defenders to try to help connect these people with services, but if the services aren't there, they can't connect them. So maybe we'll just send them to jail. That's what I hear. And is that better? Is it better to send these people to jail because if we don't have the services to help them out on the street, is that the answer?
I would say no. And there's a representative from Texas, Jerry Madden. Maybe you're familiar with him. He was a representative back in 2007, 2008, 2009. He was big on criminal justice reform. And actually, he came up to Alaska and did a couple public presentations on criminal justice reform, did a presentation to the legislature. And the answer to your question is a quote of his, which is, jails should be reserved for those we are afraid of, not those we are mad at. And we could tag on, not for those who can't access community-based services.
And that's what I tried to push back on the reporter, is that lack of safety net doesn't justify longer prison sentences. We need to fix the safety net, not keep people in prison longer. My mind explodes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And of course, there are all individual circumstances related to how the person got in there, the crimes they were convicted of, and so on and so forth. But
I
think
geriatric parole.
Yeah. And I think people will, and the research will show that after a certain age, the risk of someone reoffending is significantly
virtually zero at a certain age. I looked at a lot of federal studies yesterday about this issue. And the bottom line is that elderly people aren't really masterminding big criminal enterprises. And they're not the danger that person might have been when they were 30 years old. Anyway, that was a tangent. So you did that work for the mental health court. And then what happened?
I did that work for 5 years, and it was great. And then I transitioned and I went over to the Alaska Mental Health Trust Authority. The board of trustees at that time, under CEO Jeff Jesse, was starting to develop focus areas where they would channel funding and effort to improve systems. And one of those was this intersection between criminal justice and behavioral health. And I applied for the job, and I was hired as a program officer, and using foundation sort of lingo, my portfolio was disability justice. That was the name of the focus area.
So talk a little bit about that. I mean,
that was really just an extension of what I was doing with the Anchorage Mental Health Court. It was now I'm not working in just one little project that is based here in Anchorage, but I'm looking at the system as a whole, because the trust serves beneficiaries statewide, and looking at other pieces of the criminal justice system, corrections, law enforcement, and then the community-based system, which is really your bookends that either should help prevent people from having contact, or if people are being released and reentering communities, there's a community-based system to receive them.
So can you give an example of a typical experience that an offender might have and how the type of work that you were doing was going to change that typical? I guess what I'm trying to say is it's really hard for me to think in like generalities of like the system's not working well and we're going to improve the system to work better. Like what was happening to an individual that through system improvement, something different would happen that would lead to a better outcome?
There's lots of things. Well, let's just start off with the first point of contact, which is generally law enforcement. So we started making sure that there was law enforcement training related to basic mental health 101, I'll call it. Not trying to turn law enforcement officers into clinical social workers, but getting them to understand when someone's responding to internal stimuli, being able to identify that, understanding that there might be ways that they can adjust their interaction so that things don't escalate. And if it's appropriate, maybe divert right there on the street away from
So were you at the start of that? Were you part of the initial move to educate officers?
Yeah, and that started when I was at the court system. So it was just a continuation when I moved over to the trust.
And because it seems like today that most law enforcement officers would say, yeah, duh, we need to have that training because we're dealing with folks who have this issue. But I'm curious if 20 years ago, if there was any dismissiveness about the mental health training.
Yes, I would say yes. 20 years ago, let's go back to, 1998 is when the Anchorage Mental Health Court was established. So you're now, through Judge Roots' leadership, you're inserting a whole new way of approaching an alleged crime. And you're taking into account what are the underlying factors that really drove that as opposed to volitional criminal intent. That's a huge shift for a very traditional system. And at the judicial level, that was not openly accepted. When you're talking to law enforcement officers, this is a whole new thing. I've got to figure out whether this person should be going to the mental health court or not.
Where for them, it's like, well, they started the fire, they committed the crime, or they took the product off the shelf, they committed the crime, or whatever it was. They broke the window.
And their training, and frankly, some of the easiest way to address that is to charge you with the crime, take you down to ACC, book you in, on to the next call for service. The transformation in terms of the understanding about how mental health, substance use, behavioral health is a real driver of the criminal justice system. And in many cases, these crimes are low-level misdemeanor type crimes that are really causing the system to bog down. Has come light years. There's still a long way to go, but it certainly has improved from back then.
So that was your project work at the Mental Health Trust?
Yeah, for the first 8 years. I was at the trust for almost 20 years. So that was the first 8 years of my work at the Mental Health Trust. And I became the chief operating officer and then the CEO. And obviously I wasn't carrying a grant portfolio in those roles, but I maintained my systems level and policy work involvement related to the intersection of the two systems.
I want to talk about being CFO and CEO because that's the capacity that I first met you in, was as CEO. How did that trajectory happen? And was that something you were striving for, or did it just present itself to you?
The trajectory happens fairly early on in terms of an idea. When I was a program officer and the chief operating officer, the COO position opened up. Jeff and Delisa Culpepper were the COO at the time. They talked to me about a transition, and she was getting ready to retire, and would I like to step up into that? And Jeff was starting to think about what his trajectory was as the CEO, and it was like a succession planning. Obviously, no things were guaranteed.
How did you know that you knew how to do that job?
It's through a lot of education. B, when you're doing a job, you have mentors, you pay attention. Theoretically, supervisors provide you support and opportunities for growth and mentor you, and that happened with me. And any position you walk into, you'd like to think you know what you're going to do for all aspects of it, but that's just not reality. So you've got to be willing to take a little bit of a leap.
And did you have a good experience in leadership at the Mental Health Trust?
Yeah, great 20 years. People that really knew the mission and were passionate about the mission and were skilled professionals in their related areas of work.
What is the overarching mission?
To improve the lives of trust beneficiaries.
And who are the trust beneficiaries?
Adults and kids who experience an intellectual or developmental disability, a mental illness, a substance use disorder, Alzheimer's, dementia, other cognitive-related impairments like traumatic brain injuries.
And can you briefly explain what happened, was it 50 years ago? When the trust was created, what had happened in Alaska and why did the trust have to be created? I think it's longer.
This could be a whole different podcast.
I know. But I think it's important just briefly for people who have no idea what the trust is.
The trust is a really critical tool of Alaska and the state system, and there's nothing else like it in the country. It was born out of a lawsuit, which goes back to territory days. So When the territory was transitioning over to statehood, the federal government managed the territory. And at the time, we're talking in the late 50s. So think about this is before Prudhoe Bays, before a pipeline, more remote than we think of communities now. And there wasn't really an infrastructure, a health and social services system. So if you were in a small community or even a larger one like Anchorage, and you came to the attention of the authorities because you were responding to that internal stimuli, and there was no one to take care of you, family or friends, there was no Alaska Behavioral Health to refer you to, you could be charged with the crime of being an insane person at large. And you would be shipped to an institution in the lower 48. Morningside was the largest, and that was the mental health system. So when we transitioned into statehood, the federal government transitioned a bunch of federal lands to the new state, and they specifically allocated 1 million acres of land and put it into trust, so the Mental Health Lands Trust. And the revenues generated from those lands were specifically supposed to be used to develop health and social services for the new state. It was modeled off of the university lands trusts that were used in the lower 48 for educational systems. The legislature was designated as the trustee, and those lands, some of them got sold off, and the revenues went into the general fund. So the revenues got spread out across government services, not just health and social services. And a gentleman by the name of Fern Weiss in 1982 had a son with a severe and persistent mental illness. Side note, provided case management services to his son when I worked at the Arc of Anchorage, which I look back on my career and I look at these things and I'm like, wow, that's wild. Anyway, he sued the state because he had seen that the legislature had
Basically spent money that should have been spent on
its role as
other stuff.
A fiduciary, right? It took until 1994 for that case to get settled. And there's a lot of intricacies on that, but that's how the trust got born. It's a semi-independent corporation. It operates off of its own revenues, no state general funds. It generates revenue off of investments that have been made with the permanent fund, off of revenues generated by the trust land office. And then those funds, our percentage of those funds, get used for grant making that helps to keep the system evolving and progressing. So monies can go through the state departments like the Department of Corrections or Health or Family and Community Services, but also a lot of money goes out to the community system and the tribal health system. That is as close to a nutshell thumbnail sketch I can give you, but it's really, the trust and the way it was set up is something that's special for Alaska, and Alaskans should just be proud of it.
So I think the analogy I would use is that law enforcement or the FBI doesn't really get thanked for stopping the crimes that didn't happen because people don't know about the crimes that didn't happen. It's like, they prevented that car bomb, but no one knows about it because the car bomb didn't go off. And I think there's a lot of good things that law enforcement does that go unrecognized because they prevented bad things from happening. And so I think particularly in Anchorage over the past few years with the increase in visible homelessness, I think that there's a feeling that perhaps the trust isn't doing as much as it should because we see this increase in visible homelessness and folks therefore intuit that the trust has stepped back. The trust is not contributing as much as it should or making as big of a difference as it could because what we see is this increase. So how do you respond to that?
That is a criticism and a healthy criticism. It's not a new criticism. And I would say that the trust is not responsible for the continuum of care to be provided to our most vulnerable in the state. That is the Department of Health and the Department of Family and Community Services responsibility. And that the trust, its value to the system really is that venture capital to be able to pilot and try new things to drive the system to be more effective for the person, to be more efficient in terms of state resources and to keep pace with the way things progress in the medical field as to how treatments are developed for people who experience the health conditions that beneficiaries experience. I mentioned a little bit about South Central Foundation and Providence and what they're doing in sort of driving the behavioral health crisis system of care. The trust started that in 2018. The trust has been behind it, and I think the board just approved the newest strategic plan that includes a priority of crisis services. So without the trust, maintaining that focus, maintaining the momentum when things change in the system, that could easily falter and fall right apart, but that's going to be a huge asset, not just for Anchorage, but for the state.
I feel like there's always a tension in talking about unhoused folks, about whether we need to make sure that they have all the services that they need and then they're safe to have their own room, their own place to live, or if we just should give them their place to live now and then find their services after. It's like that the housing first versus some folks call it like the elevator approach, figuring out exactly where the correct place is for people to go. I don't know if you can respond to any of that and like where you land on the idea of the best way of helping the most unhoused people as quickly as possible.
It's called meeting the basic needs of any person. They need a place to feel safe. They need access to food, and they need to have some relationship, right? And so I think you get someone stabilized, or you get them in a place where they feel safe and you know where they're going to be, then you can start developing a relationship, identifying what the needs are, and trying to figure out where does this person want to go next? What is their next step that they want to take? What are they ready for? And then try and make that happen. Make that happen and build upon it. What's the next thing? Judge Stephanie Rhodes, in my interview with her, she's, Steve, how are you going to judge success? And I said, one step at a time with one individual at a time. And people are going to move forward, and then they're going to step back, and we're going to move forward again. That's what it takes to really engage, be authentic about that, be relentless about that. And I don't mean that in terms of a badgering sort of way, but relentless, like I'm not going to give up on you, Representative Gray. I'm going to be back tomorrow to check in and see how you're doing. And continue that so that you have the you feel the trust in the relationship that I can help you get to a place that you want to be in.
Two pieces that push back on that I have from talking to various folks working in this realm. One is that too often the person who shows up and tells the person, I'm going to be with you every step of the way and I'm going to see you here tomorrow, that person doesn't show up the next day. And it creates a sense of distrust in the person who needs the help, where they stereotype all of the services in Anchorage as being BS, and they talk a good talk, but do they actually show up tomorrow to take me to my doctor's appointment? No, they don't show up. And I've heard the grapevine that certain organizations will brag about how many contacts they've had. But if you have a contact with somebody where you say you're going to help them do something, and then you don't show up to help them do that, should you really get credit for having had that initial contact? And
that's not what I'm talking about in terms of relentless engagement.
Right.
That's a shortcoming.
Yeah.
And that's a shortcoming of parts of the system and individuals of the system. The system as a whole doesn't operate that way. There are individuals in the system that may operate that way, may have missed that contact, may have never showed up again. But I can honestly say that's not a categorical across the board the way the system operates. And then we also just need to recognize that those are experiences that people may have had, and it's important to acknowledge those and say, yeah, but today's today. What do you want to accomplish today? And I'll help you do that.
The other stereotype that's out there is that there's this contingency of unhoused folks who don't want services and don't want help. And I think even folks who promote this narrative would say that it's not a lot of people, but that there are definitely some unhoused folks who create a lot of problems and aren't really interested in getting help.
I would acknowledge that. I think there are some people out there that don't want help. Just because you have a bed available doesn't mean that's what the person wants or is ready for. So it's going to be a challenge. But let's not also overlook the other positive steps that other individuals are taking to change their lives and get down to a path of recovery. We should be applauding that, not only for that individual, but for the services that help them to get down that path. So that's how I feel about that. The homeless sector is something that I've been involved with Beans Cafe since '92 when I moved up here. And it's really challenging, and people have a lot of distrust, as you mentioned. They've also have a lot of tragic and traumatic experiences too that we need to figure out a way of helping to get them to work through that.
So why did you leave the CEO role?
I left the CEO role back in July of 2024, just because I got to a place where I needed to take a little bit care of myself, spend some time with my family. And I thought this is a time where I've been here 20 years and it's time to move on.
And you moved on to APD.
I did, yeah. I took what I described as a little micro retirement and spent several months just thinking about what is the next step, because I wasn't ready just to retire. I'm too young to retire, not in a position to retire, but really wanted to stay engaged in contributing to these systems and policy improvements.
So what is your role at Anchorage Police Department?
I am the director of Diversion Programming.
And what does diversion programming involve?
It's really supporting the MIT team, which you mentioned, the mobile intervention team, and helping to do some problem solving for them when they run into issues like Title 47 issues. That's the process for an involuntary mental health commitment, helping them develop some relationships with community providers that may not have existed before, because they're doing a lot of the street level diversion. And then also helping to set up some new diversion opportunities for APD that you could call pre-arrest deflection, pre-arrest diversion, where if I were an officer and the call for service was to you, and I looked at the situation and recognized that really what's going on here is more, again, behavioral health related, and you're interested in getting treatment, there's a pathway for you to go. And I, as the officer, could say, this is what I might have to charge you with, or I can get you into this direction today if you're interested, and you follow those recommendations and these charges don't get filed. If you fail, the charges go forward to the prosecutor's office.
And so that's really beneficial, because instead of taking them down to the station, booking them, whatever, going through this whole rigmarole, and then maybe months later, they have this opportunity for therapeutic court, for example.
Yep.
It's actually happening in real time at the very beginning,
Right,
where they're getting access to the services that they need to regain control of their lives.
Yeah, you're giving someone the opportunity to actually avoid, when appropriate and when the public safety is not at risk, and I want to emphasize that, avoid the criminal justice system, because the collateral consequences of even being charged with a crime, let alone convicted of it, are really significant. That can have an impact on your ability to get a job. It can have an impact on your ability to rent an apartment. It can have an impact on your ability to access the services that we've been talking about for the last 45 minutes. So it's really important to try, when it's appropriate, to give those opportunities to individuals.
When is MIT appropriate and when is MCT appropriate? And MCT is run by the fire department.
Yeah, so that the listeners know, that's the mobile crisis
team.
team, and that is a EMT and a clinician. And then the mobile intervention team is a police officer and a clinician. And when a call for service comes into the dispatch, they will identify whether or not someone's like in a behavioral health crisis. And depending on A, who's on shift, and B, maybe someone has a relationship with MCT that the dispatch says, okay, I'm going to,
I know that guy. Yeah.
MCT is available. I'm going
Right.
to transfer this over to the fire department and they're going to send MCT. I would say that right now, I think around for the MIT calls for service, APD's mobile intervention team, about 80% of those calls get resolved in the community. They also end up having to file commitment paperwork or serve ex parte orders, and people need that level of care and they should access that level of care. The important thing about it is that from the law enforcement perspective, not only are we meeting the people where they're at and de-escalating the situation and keeping everyone safe, it is preserving the patrol officers from responding to those calls. And I do think that there's opportunities for growth. Certainly, we have 5 MIT teams operating, and there's room, and I think the chief wants to head down to expansion of those teams. And there's also the HOPE team, which is separate from MIT, but it's an officer and a clinician, and that's focusing on the homelessness population. So that's the Homeless Outreach Prevention and Engagement team. But there is more work that could be done by both of those, all those teams. I would also just put out there that if we're talking about expanding those teams in a law enforcement agency, that should be raising red flags. What's going on in the community system that someone is not getting the services and the supports that they need, and as a result, someone in the community is calling 911, and we now have a law enforcement response to a behavioral health crisis.
As somebody who worked in the emergency departments, I don't know what the percentage of ER visits that don't really need to be in the ER, but more than half. So I feel like this is, to me, just analogous to that, is that people don't know what to do, so they call 911, and it turns into a law enforcement response. Right. I'm not necessarily sure.
But what was going on before the person decided they needed to call 911? That's where I was trying to get to, was there was a reason that someone called 911. And for the populations that we're talking about, I think it's an indication and a flag that something is not happening in the community-based system of healthcare, whether that's physical health, mental health, addiction, that's all healthcare. That's not meeting the needs of that individual. And now they're in a crisis and someone sees it and they're like, oh my gosh, I need to call 911. Something's going on. Someone needs to respond. And so I think that there are, when we're talking about expanding the only services that are open 24/7, 365, because the need is growing, from my perspective, that's a red flag.
So when Chief Case was on the podcast, my light bulb moment, and this kind of relates back to when you were talking about 20 years ago, when you were first talking to law enforcement about ways of de-escalating when somebody is having a mental health crisis. And you said, look, we're not trying to make them clinicians. We're not trying to make them social workers. But in Chief Case's interview, he said that most of police work today is social services, and only a small percentage is high-speed chases, breaking down doors, catching bad guys. And for him, he was saying, but we hire folks based on how well they can break down doors and catch bad guys. But then when they show up on the job, most of their job is actually intervening with folks who have fallen through the cracks of our system. And it's not actually the type of police work that you see on TV.
Right. The type of police work and the criminal justice system on TV is not how the police work and the criminal justice system operates in the real world. So let's just start there. And I agree with what Chief Case was saying. And I would just to expand a little bit, because I think I can give a little bit more of a flavor, Steve flavor, and I think the chief would agree with this, is 5% of the real violent, tragic, horrific things that happen is only 5%. But you hire because you've got to be able to execute on that 5%. The other pieces to that is, so when you're hiring, if you only hire with that focus and you're not thinking about all of the other work that you do that is from a law enforcement perspective, that requires maybe a little bit more interpersonal skills, a little bit more understanding of the community, a little more trust building with the community. If you don't have time for that, you're missing a big portion of what you're doing day in and day out, 365. You could call it social work. You could call it also just caretaking of the community, which at times can be responding to these kind of social work type crises. But it also bleeds into what he's really, I think, trying to do is lead APD in a direction that, from your tactical response to your dispatcher, to your records clerk, to your patrol officer, to your director of diversion programming, that we have a caretaking focus of the community as a whole. And we need to be hiring for people who recognize that there is a continuum of law enforcement response. And I'm sure he shared this with you, the guardian versus the warrior, and what does that look like? And that's the continuum of what a law enforcement agency, any law enforcement agency, but APD, has to operate within, because it could be anything on that continuum.
What does next year hold? Do you think that we've got the crisis stabilization centers coming online? You've got your role and the work that's happening with Hope and MIT at APD. Fire department has MCT. Fire department, and I don't know if it has a name, what they're going to be doing with, where they're going to have the healthcare provider in the field prescribing medically assisted therapy to drug
MAT,
addicts. Yeah, they're going to be doing MAT in the field, which I think is like brilliant. I'm not sure how that's going to work out, but it's literally, could be a game changer. So I think we've got some innovative things coming on board. Do you think that folks who don't listen to this podcast and folks who, aren't really like reading the ADN cover to cover, are they going to see a difference in Anchorage next year that they'll notice in terms of the things that so many folks are complaining about now?
I would like to say yes. And I think it is happening now. It's just happening with a smaller population. The community at large is still seeing individuals struggling, individuals who are unhoused, under the influence of substance. And that is unsettling, and it's also just tragic. But I'm coming up on a year. I'll have been with APD for a year in March. What I have seen in terms of internal coordination across departments, APD, the health department, the fire department, the mayor's office, on addressing the homelessness issue is unprecedented, in my opinion. And I'll give you an example. A concrete example is there is real-time coordination happening. If someone is out on the street and needs to get to a shelter bed, there is real-time coordination happening to figure out, where is there a shelter bed available? If there's not one, can we shuffle and move the deck around so that we can get this person housed or sheltered? And if not, then if we don't have it in one of our shelters, what are our other options to get that person off the street and out of the cold and into a warm space? It's happening in real time every day right now. And It's really incredible to see the collaboration. And to your point, I think that is going to hopefully have some change that in the coming year, the public will see in a more obvious way.
Is there anything that I didn't ask you about that you were planning on talking about?
No, this has been a great conversation. I think it's a conversation that needs to continue to happen. And I hope that people who listen to the podcast listen to it, critically think about it, challenge it, but also if they find that they are seeing these changes, even if they're small, even if they're an individual change, that they share how that system and help to create that positive change.
Steve Williams, thanks so much for being on the show.
I really appreciate this opportunity. I wish you good luck and good work down in Juneau.
Thank you so much. Thank you, listeners. If you like what you heard, please subscribe, rate, and review us. To contact me, email rep.andrew.gray@akleg.gov or call 907-269-0123.